Welcome to our lecture on fiscal policy. We're going to be going over how we can look at the business cycle and are there any macroeconomic policies that can be used to get us out of a recession. So let's examine this. So if we're going to be looking at fiscal policy, we're going to have to look at how the government exerts influence over the economy. Now, you have to understand, at the start of the 20th century, the federal government had a very small role in the overall economy. One of the reasons why it had a small role is because it was relatively small in size. For example, in 1902, the entire federal government employed only 350,000 people in the entire United States, and it spent about $650 million. Now, this is in contrast to where we are today. Right now, the federal government employs well over 4 million people and spends well over $4 trillion. So you could see how the influence of the federal government on the economy has grown because it's grown in size. Now, the big reason for the growth is the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was passed in 1913. And the reason why the 16th Amendment was such a big event when it comes to the size of the federal government and its role in the economy is because that was the amendment that gave the federal government the legal authority to tax income. Prior to 1913, the main source of revenue for the federal government were basically tariffs coming from goods into the United States. By being able to tax income, that meant that the U.S. government, federal government, was getting a lot more revenue. And with revenue comes spending, and with spending comes economic influence. So as of 2017, the federal government has collected over $3 trillion in tax revenues compared to the $650 million it was spending in 1902. So now you have to understand that government spending affects output, and output is how we measure the economy. So remember the equation for GDP. GDP, gross domestic product, which is a measurement of output, can be broken down into 4 different categories of output. Output for the consumer sector, C. Output for the business sector, which we call investment goods and services. Output for the government, and output for the foreign participants, net exports. And so you can see here, when any of these change, GDP changes up or down. So any impact in G impacts the economy. And we're breaking down GDP in this way. We could break down aggregate demand in the same way. Aggregate demand is there's demand for consumer goods. There's demand for goods and services for businesses. We call investment goods. There's demand for government goods and services. And there is demand for net exports. So we could break down aggregate demand by the 4 sources of production or the 4 sources of demand. So when the demand for government goods and services changes, the overall demand changes. Now, what we're talking about is we're talking about the government purchasing goods and services. We're not talking about income transfers, right? Income transfer is a payment to individuals for which no current goods or services are exchanged. For example, if I tax you $2 and give it to somebody else, I'm just taking income from one group and giving it to the other. I'm not changing the amount of demand. Now, technically you could say I'm changing demand. For example, let's say I take away $1 from somebody. Now, if that $1 from this person, if this person is just saving it and not spending it, and I tax this person and I give this person here the dollar, and this person spends it, then yes, you could look at income transfers impacting demand. But if this person was going to spend it, and this person will spend it, by taking a dollar from this person and giving it to this person, I'm really not affecting demand. So how can the federal government use fiscal policy to impact the economy? Well, it could do it by buying more or less goods and services. Or it could do it by raising or lowering taxes, both of which are, for example, again, if we look at aggregate demand as C plus I plus G plus NX, if I tax households less, that will give them more money to spend on goods and services, which will impact aggregate demand. Or, let me erase this, if I tax businesses less, the businesses will have more money to spend on goods and services, and that will increase aggregate demand. So you could see how changing taxes can also impact demand. So from a macro perspective, the federal budget tool is a tool that can change AD, aggregate demand, and it changes outcomes. Let me show you a nice picture that will make this clear. I like this picture. So think of this as a representation of the economy, right? Now, where supply and demand cross, aggregate demand this is going to tell you how much output is being produced, and it's going to be telling you the inflation rate, prices. Let me draw a little axis like this. Now, there are three groups of things that can shift either the AS or AD curve. There are internal market forces. For example, as we age, baby boomers are getting older. They change their behavior in terms of, let's say they are buying fewer goods and services. That's an internal market force that could shift the aggregate demand curve. Or when baby boomers retire, they stop working. That could shift the aggregate supply curve. Then we have internal market shocks. I mean, for example, the coronavirus is a very good example of an external shock to the global economy, not just the US economy. And that's causing both AD and AS to shift. And then finally, policy levers. This is monetary policy and fiscal policy by the government, and they could use their tools to shift one of these two curves. When these two curves shift, it changes outcomes. For example, if we shift the AD curve this way, AD1, we have a new equilibrium with a higher price level and a higher output level. Well, guess what? That's changed output. Output has gone up. More output means more jobs. This is leading to higher prices. So you could see how a shift in a curve impacts outcomes. So now you see if we are in a place where we don't want to be, the federal government could use its policy levers to try to shift one of these two curves to try to engineer new outcomes better to their liking. Now, suppose the economy is experiencing a recessionary gap. Now, recessionary gap simply means that where we are in terms of output is not where we want to be. There is some amount of activity, some amount of output that will put everyone to work. If we're producing a rate of output below that, that's a recessionary gap, or sometimes called a GDP gap. Let's say the value of that output that we're short is $400 billion. So again, this is called either a recessionary gap or a GDP gap. So this is where we are. But this is where we want to be. Where we are is equilibrium, where supply crosses demand. Now the question is, how do we get our equilibrium level of output equal to our full employment level of output? Well, we could use a policy goal, let's say monetary policy, to either shift the aggregate demand curve this way, or shift the aggregate supply curve this way, to try to get an intersection, an equilibrium, that's going to be equal to the full employment level of output. So in other words, we want to close this GDP gap. Now, what we're going to do in the next video is I'm going to discuss some strategies to do that. And some of the strategies are called Keynesian strategies because this was an economist, John Maynard Keynes, who proposed ways to get the economy back to full employment.